Fate Be Changed, Chapter 34, Merida. Merida let out a low groan as she hefted a gigantic clay pot out of the wash basin and set it on the floor. She took back every foul thing she'd ever said about working in the wet larder. She would gladly go back there. Even salting smelly fish was better than this back-breaking work, which was made even more difficult by having to hide all this fur and these claws. Merida had been relieved when one of Fergus's men had intercepted her and Eleanor on their ride to Clan Inez, but had taken away her opportunity to see Freya again. In addition to trying to come up with a spell to send her home, the witch was also seeking one that would reverse Merida's transformation into a bear, or at the very least slow down its progression. She had shared her first attempt with Merida when she had visited while Eleanor and Fergus were posing as husband and wife, but Freya's tincture had very little effect so far. Merida could feel her own humanity slipping away with each day that passed. Still, it was probably for the best that they were prevented from going to the village. Merida had no doubts that she and Eleanor would have been exposed if they had gone through with the princess's misguided scheme to pose as nuns from Perth. As the Dunbrook clansmen had pointed out, no nuns would be away from their nunnery so soon after Whit Sunday. The villagers have surely become suspicious. Merida was still troubled by the potential threat that lingered over the kingdom, but she was even more concerned about the princess's attempt to uncover it on her own. They had made their way back to the castle, and Merida went straight to the kitchens. She had been directed to return to her old post by order of the king himself. Except this time, instead of Duncan, Eileen was in charge of Merida's permanent assignment. And of course, she had chosen the scullery. Based on the gossip Merida had heard being passed about, which had not been whispered but instead spoken loud enough for the entire kitchen to hear, the only reason she had not been thrown out of the castle was that King Douglas had found it somewhere in his heart to let her remain. But Sorcha had given her the full story. She'd shared that one of the king's advisors had cautioned him that it was too close to the start of the Highland Games for him to release a young girl to the forest on her own. Several of the clans at the southern tip of the kingdom were already making their way toward McCameron Castle. While she would not have to worry so much about a fellow Scot from this kingdom harming her, she would be vulnerable to the vagabonds and thieves who lurked around the forest during this time of the year, searching to rob those headed for the games. Merida had no idea which advisor had spoken to the king on her behalf, but she was grateful. It had bought her more time at the McCameron Castle. During their previous trip to the village, Freya had assured her that she needed only a few more days to work on the spell that would send Merida back home. But what home would she be returning to? Merida thought about the despondency in Eleanor's voice that morning. I will never be free if I am someone's wife. It was the entire reason Merida and her mother had butted heads, because others wanted to make the decision about her future. Why had she automatically assumed that her own mother had willingly walked into her union with her father? Maybe Eleanor had felt forced to do so. Even if it had been love at first sight, or if she had grown to love Fergus over time, Merida now realized that Eleanor never really had a say in her future. But maybe she could now. A heavy weight settled in the pit of Merida's stomach. She needed to speak to Freya, although she suspected she already knew what the witch would tell her if she asked the question that had been niggling her at her all day. What are you doing just standing around? Merida whipped around to find one of the scullery maids, Esfeth, waltzing into the room with an armful of dirty bowls. The girl had not liked Merida from the very first day and she had arrived to work at the larder, and her disdain had only seemed to grow now that Merida was working in the scullery. She walked past Merida, clipping her with an elbow. Sorry, I did not see you, Elsfeth said over her shoulder. Merida ignored her apology and reached for another clay pot. A second later, Elsfeth bumped into her in the middle of her back, causing her to drop the pot in the basin and splash water across her frock. Hey! Merida yelled. Her limbs tensed and a flash of heat flushed through her body. Oh, did you move, lass? I did not see you there again, Elsfeth said. What ails you? Merida ground out. You ail me, the girl spat, all pretense of innocence gone. Merida just stared at her for a moment, dumbfounded by her admission. She clenched her fists, struggling to maintain her calm. What did I ever do to you? She asked. The girl set the bowl on the table next to the basin and then plopped her hands on her hips. The malevolence in her expression made Merida's blood run cold. "Want to know why I don't like you, lass? 'Tis because I don't trust you. No one does. You show up here from out of nowhere, walking around like you're better than everybody else. You chum up to the princess and have her treating you all special-like, but now look at you." She huffed and peered down her pointy nose at Merida. "You're no different than any of us, covered in dirty, smelly dishwater." It took everything Merida had within her not to declare herself the princess of the kingdom of Dunbrock. She knew if she did, Elspeth would only laugh at her, and that made the rage within her flare to life. The intensity of her fury frightened her. The tenuous hold she had on her emotions was both confusing and disturbing. She did not understand what was happening to her. "You know nothing about me," Merida told her. The girl looked her up and down. "You're right about that, lass. No one seems to know anything about you, except that you come here on a fancy horse and that you've got some sort of sorcery up your sleeve." "Sorcery?" Merida scoffed. "That is ridiculous. Why else would Princess Eleanor pick you to be her new maid, when everybody knows it should have been Bridget? You must have put a spell on her." Merida turned away from the girl. Her words were too close to what Merida had originally intended for her mother. When she thought about the first time she had met Freya, and how she had willingly traded her necklace for a spell to change the queen, it made Merida stick to her stomach. She would have given everything to have that day back. "Why are you still here?" Elspeth asked. "That bump on your head is healed. You should be gone back to where you came from." If everything went according to what Merida and Freya had devised, Elspeth would get her wish. But she would not give the girl the satisfaction of knowing that. "Apparently, King Douglas would like me to remain in his employ," she said instead. "I shall stay on at the McCameron Castle for as long as the king and queen would like me to be here." The look the girl leveled at her could have scorched the fur growing on Merida's skin. Elspeth pointed to the waning fire underneath the pot of water that was constantly boiled for cleaning. "Do your job and get more peat for the fire," Elspeth said before stomping out of the room. Merida yearned to lash out at that sour-faced lass. The urge to do so hummed through her entire being. Merida sucked in several deep breaths. Until that point, her transformation had been limited to her body, but now Merida felt it in her soul. She was changing into someone, or something she no longer recognized, and that was far scarier than the sudden appearance of the fur and claws. Merida had to speak to Freya. They must find a way to slow the progression of that spell before it was too late. But that was not the only reason she needed to speak to Freya as soon as possible. She was the only person who could provide the answers Merida sought. At least she hoped Freya held the answers. If the witch did not know the consequences of Eleanor's choosing not to marry, Merida was unsure what she would do. Another maid, Ailsone, came out of the washroom. Merida braced herself for another attack, but Ailsone's small smile reminded her that not all of those in the kitchen hated her. The girl had never been particularly friendly, but she was not overtly nasty like Elspeth, Eileen, and some of the others. Ailsone used to pail up to scoop water into the bucket, used for mopping the floors. "The water is a bit tepid," the girl said. "You should get more peat." "I was just about to," Merida said. She noticed the girl looking at her hands and quickly shoved them behind her back. The more she filed down these claws, the faster they seemed to grow. Goodness, but she hoped Freya would be successful in finding that spell at least. She grabbed one of the burlap sacks that was used to haul peat from the storage, then headed for the door that led outside. Because peat was used in all areas of the castle, from the kitchens to the fireplaces to in each bedchamber, the room that housed it was centrally located. Merida was grateful she had yet to experience having to haul the heavy bags during the rain. She had been told that one had to carry the peat underneath one's kirtle to prevent it from getting wet. Just as she rounded the structure, she noticed shadows stretching across the ground. A second later, she heard voices. Merida stopped short. It could not be Eileen again, could it? But she instantly recognized the girl's nasal tone. Though unlike the previous time that she had happened upon Eileen engaged in a whispered conversation with some lad, the other voice did not sound like Eleanor's betrothed. They also were not whispering. Whoever the other voice belonged to was a lad with a brogue even thicker than Merida's father. "It has to be tonight," the man said with a thick baroque. "No, 'tis too soon." This from Eileen. "'Tis better to wait until the other clans are here. That has always been the plan." "What about the princess?" Merida's back went ramrod straight at the sound of a third voice, another she did not recognize. "Are you sure she was with a Dunbrock?" the mysterious new voice asked. "I saw it myself. The big one they call Fergus. They were at the creek, and there was another lass with her, the one with the bandage on her head." Merida barely managed to hold in her gasp. "Lachlan suspected something was not right," the man continued. "'Tis why he had me follow the princess after he and the Fraser were here the other night." Lachlan. That was the princess's betrothed who had said to spy on their trails, not King Douglas. "Sneaking around with a filthy Dunbrock," Eileen said, the word dripping with disgust. "She should be hanged." Merida clenched her fist so tightly that her claws nearly pierced her skin. She strived to tamp down the fury bubbling up inside her, before it caused her to do something irrational. "Do not say that, Eileen." "It is true," the girl said. "I do not understand why you hate the princess so much. You and Eleanor used to be the best of friends when you were both wee lasses." "Not any more." "What should I tell Lachlan?" the other man said, his voice anxious. "Tell him I will take care of it," Eileen said. "That is not enough. Lachlan will want to know more." "He does not need to know any more," Eileen countered. "We stick to the original plan. Now get going." Merida flattened herself against the castle wall, but the person must have gone the opposite direction. "What are you going to do, Eileen?" the other man asked. "'Tis no concern of yours. Now go. You need to get back to the stables, Gregory." Gregory? Where had she heard that name? Merida waited for her back against the stone wall for several more minutes before she chanced peeking around the corner. They were gone. She rolled up the burlap sack and stuffed it behind the stone wall near the castle. She did not have time to worry about the dwindling fire in the scullery. She needed to speak to the princess. The chieftain of Clan Fraser and his son were due to return to their castle that night for another dinner. Merida could not let Eleanor dine with her future betrothed without letting her know that he was the one who had sent someone to follow them. Merida had suspected Lachlan Fraser was not to be trusted from the moment she had first discovered him with Eileen outside the larder. After this latest revelation, there was no lingering doubts. He and Eileen were embroiled in some sort of dalliance, and he was likely having Eleanor followed to make sure she did not find out. Merida raced up the front stairs, the ones she was not supposed to use as a member of the kitchen staff. She could not be concerned with Queen Katerina's barbaric rules. She had to reach Eleanor. But when Merida opened the door to her bedchamber, the princess was nowhere to be found. Instead, she faced a young girl who shared Orla's strong facial features. This must have been Bridget. "Where might I find the princess?" Merida asked. "I must speak to her." She braced herself for more of the nastiness she had encountered from Elspeth in the scullery, but she did not sense any malice coming from Bridget. "The princess just left for dinner," the girl answered. "No." "Why?" Bridget asked. Merida toured out of the room without further explanation. She ran down the corridor, dodging servants left and right. Relief soared through her when she spotted Eleanor's deep brown hair at the end of the long hallway. "Princess!" Merida called, just as Eleanor was preparing to descend the staircase. The princess whipped around. The flash of delight that lit her eyes quickly turned to concern. "You should not be here," Eleanor said in a low voice. "I do not care what father does to me, but I do not want to make you a target of his ire again." "Do not worry about me," Merida said. "I need to tell you about—" Just then a loud crash and a yell came from the area of the great hall. Merida and Eleanor looked at each other, then took off.